Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. We're following two really good panels, and I expect this to be equally good. So, my name is Gerard Robinson. I am a fellow of practice at the Institute for Advanced Studies Culture at the University of Virginia, also a former fifth grade teacher here in Los Angeles, so it's good to be back in Southern California. Cool. When we think about civics, we've heard a great deal about what it means for students, for the nonprofit sector, and higher ed. But we know that if you look at least 33 states, education is the #1 line item in the governor's budget. And so a lot of the work we're talking about takes place at the state level. And I've got three wonderful state leaders with me who are going to have a conversation about the future of civics. And a couple of times we've mentioned Civics Secures Democracy Act, formerly known as Education for Democracy Act. That's really important because the name tells you everything you need to know. Civics securing democracy. We've got to secure it. And so when you're looking at a $1 billion annual investment for 5 years, $585 million going to the states, and these state leaders know about money coming from the feds coming to the state level, but the majority of that's going to be sub-grants to the local school district or system, so that's great. You've got another $200 million allocated toward nonprofit organizations. These are the ones we partner with. I like the NOAA approach. We need to partner to sail the seas of economic and civic uncertainty. You're going to look at $150 million for higher ed. We know the important role that'll play, but also $50 million for researchers. Guess what? We need to know we've got best practices, people who can tell us how things are working, and $15 million to support the diversity of the teaching corps, who's going to work in this area. So I'm going to introduce each one of them, and then I'm going to open up with a general question. So we've got Chris Reagan, who is the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington State, so our West Coast person on the panel. Next to him is Katie Jenner, who is the Secretary of Education for Indiana. Come to find out we've got a mutual friend in that state. And last but not least, we have Jillian Balow, who is the Superintendent of Education in Virginia, my home state. So good to have my superintendent with me. So here's just the first general question. Give us an example, really an idea of how civic learning is taking place in Washington, Indiana, and Virginia, and then we'll go from there. Let's go ahead and start with you.
Great, thank you. And thanks for having us here at the Reagan Library and just all the partnerships that are bringing this together. Washington State isn't a whole lot different than the rest of the country in that we've got really, I think, very powerful standards, very important standards. But as you can imagine, our educators are both heroic and crushed right now. Everyone wants them to do another thing. Every content area wants more time, and time is that really powerful variable that we are all trying to figure out. So our standards are good. I take zero credit for that. I've got a colleague here, Jerry Price, who leads that work in Washington State. Many of you know him, certainly on the West Coast. We've also adopted a standalone civics course. Ours is a state that concluded just asking educators to find some time wasn't sufficient for the engagement that we really wanted. This is a high school course. It does have to be standalone. But again, our standards do ask for sort of civics in its more classic sense in all of our grades. I hope we get to talk a little bit about where we're going, because that's where we are today. Also some great Western state relationships, thinking about how to turn civics into a more active participatory action. And in our state, we're one of those states that are starting to make a movement towards multiple pathways to graduation and competency-based learning, which can include project-based work. So you're going to see civics as projects elevated in Washington State, and we have a foundational leader here that I'm going to track down because she does it in multiple states. So that's Washington in a little nutshell.
Always good to hear from Washington. What about Indiana?
Well, in Indiana, we have a variety of different initiatives that are we have the potential to really converge into something very special. So our Indiana Bar Foundation leader is here, Chuck Dunlap in the back, and they have been a huge leader in Indiana pushing this civics work for a bit of time. So while we have civic standards that spiral throughout our Indiana curriculum, we now, beginning next school year, have a required civics course for every sixth grader in Indiana. My hope is that it's not just a sit and get, but in the perfect case, it'd be exactly what we heard from this panel with the experiential learning. And obviously, we'll build resources out to to push that. The high school level in U.S. government, we do have a naturalization exam, but I think bigger than all of that has to be, in each of our states, what are our key focuses? And when we stepped back as a team and looked at that in Indiana, we can't boil the ocean, even though we get hit by lobbyists every day. We have to really focus in. And so what we heard loud and clear from the citizens of Indiana, the 5 key characteristics of focus, one of those being civics literacy. And so with that, then becomes the question, well, if that's a priority, where are we today? And how do we think about measuring that in the future? So civics will be a part of Indiana's new Indiana GPS, Indiana Graduates Prepared to Succeed dashboard, and we're still contemplating again how we might measure that. One final thing I just will add, in Indiana, our graduation diploma requirements shifted a bit to graduation pathways, where we used to have, you had to have your core courses as well as pass a test. In our graduation pathways, there are 3 components. That second component requires every senior graduating from an Indiana high school, in order to earn a diploma, you have to have a work-based learning experience, a service-based learning experience, or project-based learning experience with clear evidence as to how that was completed. So again, I shared with you a variety of initiatives that are our opportunity now is really to pull it together and then run forward faster.
Great. The Commonwealth.
All right, the Commonwealth it is. Virginia is in the midst of a review process, a review and adoption process for our history and social science standards, and that includes civics education. And I came in during the 3rd quarter of that. Most of that work was done prior to Governor Youngkin being elected and prior to my being appointed by Governor Youngkin to serve as the Commonwealth Superintendent of Public Instruction. So there's been it's become something that was already emotional and political is now more emotional and more political and more combustible. So it was really heartening to have affirmed with data what I believe, and that is I've never met a person who said, I don't want my child to have a great civics education. I've never met a person who says, I want you to restrict my child's civics education. In fact, it's just the opposite across the board. So in Virginia, taking the time to get it right, taking the time to listen, taking the time to incorporate lots of voices and make sure that we have a standards product that is reflective of the voices and reflective of what we all expect when we answer the questions to Mr. Buchanan's survey, if we took it. And underpinning all of that, earlier this week, we had our NAEP scores, our nation's report card came out. And this year it was just for reading and math, 2022 scores for reading and math. And it was a rough day for those of us in our seats to hear the news about how the learning loss has impacted reading and math. The truth is that the last time our NAEP test, the nation's report card, assessed social studies, the story wasn't much different. We had about 1/4 of the students nationwide who were proficient or advanced in civics education. That's 8th graders. We have some work to do nationwide, and we've known that for a really long time. So really bringing that data, our assessment data, front and center, and being able to front load the standards work that we're all doing in our states is very, very important. Just a couple of ways that we're doing that in addition to what I just described are, number one, we're thinking right now about teacher training. We're on the 2nd generation, really maybe the 3rd generation of teachers who either didn't access a high quality civics education in K-12 or they didn't access high quality civics education training in their educator prep program. And now they're in the classroom and we're putting emphasis on civics education. And we need to make sure that as state leaders, we're really front-loading all of that with great teacher training opportunities, not to just teach the content, but also to teach teachers how to teach difficult subjects. There's more to that. In education, at the heart of policy, we're about inputs and outputs, and I'm sure we'll have more opportunities to talk about that in this panel.
Absolutely. And one thing I want to do is, again, thank Janet and Danielle and John for putting together not only this event, but this panel. For perspective, you have over approximately 13,000 school districts in the United States, over 90,000 principals, nearly 3 million teachers. You only have 50 plus your peers in the territories in the country. And so they get a chance to see from a macro level what's taking place in the state. And so from the macro level, provide us an example of something you're seeing in your state, Washington, on the civil or the civic learning piece that's really doing well, but also identify a challenge, whether it's institutional, political, or otherwise.
Well, I think what's going well is that when you adopt a civics requirement, you change the mindset, particularly of your high school system, who realizes they have to change master schedules. They have to create capacity for students to take courses, to get the credit, to graduate. So a lot of attention finally falls to civics to say, how do we do this? That's a positive thing. There are other subjects that would say, wait a second, I think I just lost an elective course that I used to teach. What happened here? My message to them is, you've had a good run for 20 years. It's time to teach some civics. So no disrespect to all the other content areas. Actually, the key here is when it's done well, none of those other things actually pay a price, because integrated standards are the only way to address this issue I keep bringing up, which is time. We're on the same 1,000 instructional hours really anywhere in the country. Almost all the world's 1,000 annual instruction hours. That's 10% of a student's year. We get them for 10% of their year. And all of that content, all of those learning standards, all of that expectation, nutrition, transportation, you name it, when you're running a school system, it is a complicated endeavor. And America says more math, more science, more art, more health, more civics, more computer sciences. And our message is we can do a lot of those things with professional learning, with the incredible 3.5 million educators in this country and 50 million kids who want it, but we need to integrate subjects. You cannot have standalone content and have this republic survive if you're putting all the eggs in the K-12 education basket to get kids ready for the world when they're 18. Something really does have to fundamentally change. What's challenging? What's challenging is that in all of our pockets, and really for 60% plus of the nation's 12-year-olds and older, they've got this thing. It's a powerful, powerful tool for learning, but what comes with it, and we've talked about it a bit in our group earlier, is that it's a monetized system to put images and ideas in front of people, and the more time they spend on that, and the more you reinforce what those students already like, the more time they spend on it. And so we are reinforcing in the American democracy the idea that you can customize everything you want, including your perspective on hard things. So what's hard is getting the space necessary to have students say, this is a powerful tool for research and content and social and music and video and other amazing things. And there are times to look at each other and say, why do you think differently than I do? And how do we understand that? And how can I jump on the other side of the argument and see it from your perspective? So developing civic thinkers in an era of customization and monetizing, quite frankly, more fear than hope, that is the biggest challenge that we face. And I'm hopeful, because if you just heard from that last panel, they didn't find the 2 most amazing students in Southern California. They just found 2 of the millions of students who think this way. They think big, they think globally, they volunteer locally. Our students have a concept of civic education that isn't institutions necessarily, even though those are foundational pieces. It isn't processes like how bills become a law. Those are very important foundations. They think about civic engagement. Teach me how to go have impact so that the things I see that haunt me, and our kids are waiting, they're wearing the weight of the world right now on lots of macro issues. They want to know how to turn it into action, and that is so exciting to me. It's always challenging, and I'm a parent of 2 teenagers, to realize that when you're doing it right, they make your life uncomfortable because they want control. And that's exactly what we should be teaching them. And I think we've got it. We've just got to put those standards in place, the professional development in place. We've got to integrate standards, and we've got to give students the space to turn civics, as many of us knew it, into action in their local community. And I think that's how students flourish. So big, big barrier is what we are up against in the world of monetizing clicks.
Great.
You got some snaps. Heard it. Heard that. Positives. Reading, STEM, and civics. I've had Democrats and Republicans in my office eager to talk about those subject areas. So civics, thinking about Brent. Is Brent still here? Brent's data is just so impressive and thoughtful. And what he showed us through quantitative data, we are seeing in action. And I'm a big believer in the world of policy. When the door is open, or even if the window is cracked, you sure as heck better get through that opening, because it can close pretty quickly. So that's the real positive. The threat or the challenge, I think, that we have as we think about how to scale this as a country comes when you think about other topics that we've tried to scale as a country. A couple of things come to mind. Number one, I think we have to apply the KISS method, if that makes sense, the keep it simple method. I think we have to. Because the reality is, all of us in here are somewhat of policy wonks, and like we dig this stuff. The other reality is, when it comes to implementation, you have to imagine a principal or a superintendent or a teacher or a student standing up and presenting that to the school board and the community. Just when I was out in the library, I had an older couple, probably like 65, 70. I don't want to judge. I don't see them here. But they said, they were asking me for directions. I guess I look like I work here, Janet. And I was like, I don't know. And they said, well, why are you here? And I said, well, I'm here to talk about civics. And they said, well, we've seen all these signs. What does that even mean? And I was like, oh, I can't say if I almost said, oh, damn, but I shouldn't say damn. Sorry, it's recorded. But I was like, oh, okay. This is the question. What is civics? This is what we have to define. What are we talking about here? And I think Janet said earlier, is it Reagan, what America is and what America represents to the world. And then Bridge said, what are each of our contributions to our country? What's your value? What's your purpose in this work? And so if we really keep it simple and focused in on that, I think we can continue to win a lot of people in this area. And then the final threat is if we don't keep it pure. There's so many initiatives that have been attempted to scale nationwide, and they start out as these obvious definitions, and next thing you know, this state's adding this thing, this state's adding this thing, national media picks it up, and it explodes it for the rest of our states. And I don't have to use any examples because we all have those going through our mind right now, but I think we really together have to seek to provide clarity, keep it simple, and also keep it pure. Avoid the rabbit holes, avoid the add-ons.
Great. Gosh, that's a tough act to follow, Dr. Jenner.
You can.
But I'm going to give it a try. I think one of the greatest success nationwide is that this is evidence-based, right? We know what happens when kids have a great civics foundation. We saw that play out in the conversation on the last panel. We know that kids who have a solid foundation in civics are more likely to be engaged in volunteer and service in their community. They're more likely to run for office and talk to their policymakers at the local and state and national level. We know that they're more willing to talk about civics and politics at home, and all of those things are good. Resonating in the halls of the Reagan Library is this concept of informed patriotism, which really is twofold. It's learning about America's constitutional democracy and understanding the immense responsibility that we have as Americans to uphold that. So if we take that as sort of the national success model, I think all three of us would be able to point to examples in our states about successes, infrastructures that we have in place, places where we've been able to leverage great programs like Civics, We the People, and all of the resources that are out there. It's nice to see this space really coalescing to provide more of an infrastructure for us so that we're not cobbling it together or kind of one piece, two-piecing it. And, but we all have those small successes, right? I did this job, state superintendent, as an elected official in Wyoming. And we brought to bear what's called Indian Education for All in Wyoming, and that is simply us saying, you know what, we have a sovereign nation inside of Wyoming, and what those kids are learning about their sovereign nation and their culture should be something that every student in Wyoming has access to. That's a policy decision. Took us a couple of years and we got it done. It can be done. We're working on some of the same types of policy concepts in Virginia as well. So from a policy standpoint, it's time, and I can't think of a better and more bipartisan space than civics education to get that done. Also, you know, there are just so many, and I know we have lots of them in the room, but there are so many great philanthropic organizations who really contribute to or who add value to everything that we're doing at the local and the state and the national level with respect to civics education and the opportunities that kids have. And so I think that the successes are all around us in education. And for the three of us up here and our colleagues across the nation, sometimes it's wrangling that. It's wrangling it in our own state. It's getting together as colleagues and saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? And how can I make that happen in my state? And it's really relying on the people who are watching and who are out in this audience today, who are really helping to create an organized space to have these conversations and to build these infrastructures.
As the leader of your state for education, you've got a powerful voice, and you also have peers to help out. When I opened up and discussed the Civics Secures Democracy Act, we've discussed that act or civics in general as relates to educational achievement in terms of better civility amongst adults and students. But there's also a very important underlying fact we often don't discuss, and that's national security. At some point, this is really a conversation about our nation and our security as a people. And so as state leaders, how do you think about not only that for the role you have, but articulating that idea beyond just the classroom, but into the classroom of being, you know, a constitutional democracy?
It's such a powerful question, and I'm glad you have asked this. We are the wonks and the nerds who love this. I'm a former social studies teacher. I could sit up here for 10 hours. I could lay out all the plans in the world.
And then Janet will follow up to make 10 minutes.
Excellent. Our students need to know why it's relevant, and part of our responsibility, I think, is to continue to talk about how fragile the republic is. A constitutional democracy is only good so long as we can keep it, right? So for me, it is fundamentally a national security risk when you think about any foreign nation that can use the mediums that we have today. It's not just 3 stations that we all watched on TV and a newspaper. There are so many mediums now to get to an American people and turn them on each other. So the idea that we need to know not just civics, the foundational principles of our republic, our founding institutions, how we engage in our democracy, but to make sure that we know how we get information. Not just information literacy, which our standards have gotten better at in this country for the last 20 years, but converting that to media literacy, little m. A blogger, it turns out, doesn't know everything. Isn't that amazing? It's one opinion. And a TikTok video doesn't make it fact. So we've got a lot of work to do to talk about what it means to be influenced, and that can go into our standards. So for me, it's a 2-pronged approach as we move our standards from these really good things we've had that are relatively traditional to where we're going. It's really getting students to engage at every level, every grade, integrated by subject and media literacy. There should never be a year in school, a grade in school, where students don't understand, how am I getting this information? What does it mean? Who's influencing me and why? You know, we should generate a little cynicism in our kids, not in a negative way, but in a critical thinking way. And then the last thing for me is civility. It is not enough in this republic, if it's going to survive, to know we have differences and to understand what we believe in terms of our constitutional principles if we can't tolerate, respect, and understand where somebody else is coming from. Those are skills. Those aren't just things you say to students. They go, yeah, of course I'll do that. You actually have to practice the skills of civility in school. And I think we do a pretty darn good job, but we have them for 10% of their time. So what kind of civility are they engaged in their community, at home? What are they watching in Medium? How are they interacting on that video game console where their friend is halfway around the world and they're raging on each other? This stuff is so real to our kids, and most of us never experienced it, so it's hard for us to contextualize what it means to protect this country from a national security standpoint by creating civility so that we stay relatively committed to what it means to be an American, and then doing it in a way that's integrated in other subjects and ultimately empowering our kids to be critical thinkers that are moving us together, not tearing us apart. It is a genuine threat today.
You know, piggybacking off of what you're sharing and also what you said earlier, Jillian, if we are honest with ourselves, knowing, I mean, in Indiana, we serve 1.12 million students. No, Virginia.
1.3.
Come on, really? 1.3? She had to beat me. Did you hear that? Did everyone pick that up?
1.1001.
Okay.
I win.
Thank goodness. We won't even ask him because we know he has all of us beat with how many students that he served over the years. But when we think about the students and we go back to those key questions, let's think about how many students can answer it. Let's just start with one. What America is and what America represents in the world. Just starting there, if students can't answer that, if that's not a national security threat when you don't deeply love your country and what it represents and who we are, and then you dig into the contributions and the civility you mentioned, and going back to that couple I met out in the hallway, and we talked about civics back and forth. What I didn't share with you is at the end of the conversation, the gentleman looked at me and he said, and he didn't know what I did at all, but he said, yeah, they don't teach that in schools anymore. And I'm like, God, come on. Yeah, you know, and I kid you not, he said that. And I said, well, we're working on it. And he was like, well, we're counting on you all to figure it out, you know. But I shared with you before in Indiana what we've tried to move and tried to do, and I feel like we're just at the very start, honestly. But what I'll add is, like, for example, even though we're doing some of the key things, what we're seeing in our data as we're looking at can our students answer these questions, and we have a report that's being published for the first time on November 1st about kind of the state of can students even answer the naturalization exam questions, which is very basic, right? That's a very, very much a start, not a deep critical thinking. It's a bit alarming, and we're a state who's really working at it, and I still know our data, and so now's the time. It's urgent. And again, so glad you brought us forward. I'm assuming these are conclusion remarks because I'm watching the time, so I'm going to pass to Jillian.
All right, here we go. You know, I think that the most important thing that we can do for our students to help them recognize just the impact of civics education is to teach them the impact of civics education as it relates to them in their kindergarten classroom, in their school, in their neighborhood, and in their community, and in their state. It's pretty glitzy and fun to think about the latest presidential gaffe or the color of the president's skin or you know, what have you. Those are things that are in front of us on social media. But what's much more impactful for our lives from day to day to day is what's happening in our neighborhood and what's happening in our school. So in Virginia, we're getting ready to have an election, and there are so many schools in Virginia that are holding mock elections, and I know that that's normal, But think about that. That is so profoundly important for our students to go through an experiment like that, and such a privilege for our American students to go through an exercise like that and learn about the democratic process, learn about the political system, learn about voting from the time that they're in kindergarten, and so that voting and being a citizen and civics education is an institution in their lives, and it's something that they carry with them, not something that they see on social media, but that's something that is a part of them. So I think that the best gift that we can give to ourselves that we can give to our children is to really help them understand how civics education is playing out in their school, their neighborhood, and their community. And I know that there are lots of business and community leaders who are in the audience today, and I would encourage you to never ever give out a scholarship again without taking time to get to know the scholar and taking time to follow up with them to talk about their experiences in college. Never ever have a lunch or a fundraiser without inviting and including students, because you are part of that civics education for students. You are part of those service opportunities and part of that community service service opportunity that students are seeking, that we saw in the last panel, and you get to be the conduit for those students. So we can talk about the big picture civics, but kids really care about, why does it matter to me? And that's what we want to bring to the classrooms via great teachers and great training and great curriculum every day.
So Chris, Katie, Jillian, thank you so much. Also, thank you for civics in practice, because there are other things you could have done with your professional job than decide to go and become a state chief leader. So that's civics in action. Since we're at the Ronald Reagan Museum, remember A Nation at Risk was published in the 1980s. And there's a phrase in there that talks about, if a foreign nation were to come and attack us, what kind of state will we be in? I would say the answers that we've heard here are, I would say, definitely good food for thought, but this is a partnership perspective. So thank you, state chiefs, and thank you for your work.